wasila badamonje kola waliande faye moni.
Good morning, Professor Richard. We are very delighted having you for this conversation. As we already said, we are at the midway of our session. We already cover 1 week, and we are in the second week. And during this second week, we already had your conversation will be the last, one of the last presentation before the student, the doctorand and postdoc integrated all the competency and all the knowledges in the, to see how they can improve their own project. So we are very delighted having you in this conversation, which will allow our colleague to be more informed about how in your own work you were dealing with numbering, and how based on a sample of your work they can learn about your experiences. My colleague Beatrice will summarize your presentation in French. The presentation will be made in English, and the majority of our colleagues are already familiarized with English, which is also a way to be really part of the international academic world. So, well, we have colleagues from Madagascar, we have colleagues from Burkina Faso, we have colleagues from Cameroon, we have colleagues from Niger, and we have colleagues also from France, you know, and Senegal. I think that the range of countries being part of this exciting experience, you know, to see how we can integrate it more, we can deal with numbering in order to improve the qualitative work. And even if we are developing a quantitative work, how we can be able to be very critical about what is numbering, the meaning of numbering, and so on. So let's welcome Professor Richard Robert. Saluer pour nos collègues Richard Robert de Stanford University. Vous le verrez, il a fait l'essentiel, une bonne partie de ses travaux de recherche sur le Soudan français, le Mali actuel, et aujourd'hui en histoire d'Afrique, sur les questions d'histoire, sur les questions de travail, sur les questions de civilisation. C'est un des experts mondiaux les plus reconnus. Nous avons partagé avec vous son dernier livre, Les deux mondes du coton, hein, qui était d'abord paru en anglais et qui est disponible en français, qui a été traduit, publié par Cartala en collaboration avec l'Institut de Saint-Louis. Vous avez tous reçu un exemplaire de ce document. Vous avez la chance aujourd'hui d'interagir avec Richard Robert. Donc, ne ratez pas l'occasion de pouvoir saluer, interagir avec Richard Robert et de partager son expérience. Je suis là aussi avec ma collègue Salimata Nébié du Burkina Faso, une historienne qui s'est spécialisée aussi sur les questions de la gestion de la gouvernance locale et les questions de sécurité. Je vais lui passer la parole pour un mot de salutation.
Alors, d'autant plus merci que, compte tenu des heures, je pense qu'on a un gros décalage horaire et que c'est pas du tout facile pour vous, c'est pas forcément facile pour vous de vous connecter. Donc merci. Merci aussi parce que Babacar m'avait fait connaître votre livre. Je ne suis pas une spécialiste de l'histoire de l'Afrique, mais plutôt de l'histoire des chiffres et l'histoire des chiffres en Afrique m'intéresse de plus en plus. Hein. J'avais rencontré cet ouvrage grâce à Babacar. Alors, les deux mondes du coton, ce que je peux vous dire, vous ne pouvez pas le voir, mais c'est que tous les étudiants, on est à peu près une petite vingtaine là, ont cet ouvrage sur la table, sur leur table devant, et que il y a plusieurs ouvrages, ça j'en suis un peu navrée, mais bon, qui sont cornés, qui sont abîmés parce que visiblement ils ont beaucoup feuilleté ces ouvrages-là. Vraiment merci d'arriver à attirer des étudiants avec un livre. Je crois que c'est un grand privilège. Donc et pour nous, c'est un privilège d'autant plus important que vous êtes là ce soir et qu'on pourra du coup en discuter. Je vais juste rappeler que vous étiez directeur du Centre d'études africaines à Stanford, donc aux États-Unis, et que ces instituts ou ces centres d'histoire africaine ont un très grand rôle, et il y en a plusieurs aux États-Unis, ont un très grand rôle à l'égard des étudiants justement pour faire connaître hein, et pour développer aussi ces histoires de l'Afrique, et en particulier bien sûr hein, de l'histoire économique de l'Afrique à laquelle nous sommes tous attachés. Voilà, je ne vais pas monopoliser la parole, ce n'est pas du tout l'objectif, donc je vais vous laisser la parole, vous prenez le temps que vous voulez et j'essayerai de préciser un certain nombre de points si jamais il y a des étudiants qui ne comprennent pas ici. Il y a beaucoup de Camerounais qui sont complètement bilingues hein, pour la plupart. Bon, il y a plusieurs étudiants ici qui sont complètement bilingues. Donc merci beaucoup, je vous laisse la parole et voilà. Est-ce que vous avez quelque chose à projeter? On a votre livre hein, déjà, mais bon, est-ce que vous avez un diaporama? Est-ce que vous voulez que je partage? Vous voulez que je partage l'écran?
So shall I begin?
Yes, when you want.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Babakar Fall, for organizing this important school for your PhD students and your postdocs to deal with the issues about taming the numbers. So what I would like to do with you in this short presentation is to begin a little bit about looking. I have some thoughts and suggestions about the debates in social history. Then we'll look a little bit at what constitutes the archives, and particularly the bias in the archives. I think it's very important for all students who are dealing with issues of quantitative data to understand some of the biases that are done in the production of these data. And then I will talk a little bit about how I've used quantitative data in 3 different projects. And we can come along and talk a little bit about that as we go along. So let me begin.
Yes, you can.
So do you see the second slide?
Yes, yes, very well.
Okay, so I find very useful this debate in social history between Charles Tilly, who is a European historical sociologist, and David Cohn, who is trained both as a historian and as an anthropologist of Africa. And they share in common certain concerns, and they differ dramatically in their understanding of what those concerns, how we should approach those concerns. For Charles Tilly, he's very concerned with the emergence of industrial capitalism and the nation state in Europe. Tilly sees these 2 elements, industrial capitalism and the nation state, as providing for the big changes, the dramatic changes that affected all of European life. And so his big concern is how ordinary people live these big changes. And he proposes as the methodology to do a collective biography looking at statistical reconstruction of the working class. So at the foundation, he uses statistics archives and memoirs of the working class themselves. Part of what Tilly is doing in his presentation of these concerns about social history is to essentialize in saying that these two issues, industrial capitalism and the nation state, affected all people in the world globally similarly. And this is where David Cohn says that's not the case. What David Cohn is concerned with is the same kind of issue, but he is concerned not only how people live these big changes, but what the experience of these big changes meant to them in terms of their own culture. And for David Cohn, the big changes that affected his research site, which is in East Africa, essentially on the border between Uganda and Kenya, is the intensification of the slave trade, colonial conquest, and colonialism itself. And as his unit of analysis, he's interested in small-scale communities, individual households, and actually individuals themselves. And his method is to focus on cultural history, by which he means that these big changes become meaningful to the people who live in these communities only through the culture of their societies, what he calls the interior architecture of their societies. And his primary sources are not statistics, archives, or memoirs, but oral histories, which of course means that he is not, the kind of work that he is doing is not amenable to the kind of quantitative assessment of what is going on. In my own research, I tend to focus more on the Tilly approach, but instead of looking at industrial capitalism and the nation state, I focus on colonial conquest, colonialism, colonial institutions, and how individuals use these institutions and how that affected their lives and changed them. And to do so, I look at archives primarily. I do oral history, but I also use statistical information when I can find it. But now let's go through a little analysis about how we go about doing that. And I hope that many of you have already been exposed to archives because they become the foundation for the study of the past. This is a 1910 postcard, a photograph of the archives in Kuluba outside of Bamako, where I've done most of my research. And what is important about this particular archive is that it's located just next to the presidential palace or the governor's palace. And it shows you the significance that archives have for the colonial state and the post-colonial state. The building itself looks exactly the same. You can see the steps in the front, and this is what the archives, the old archives look like. And to the right, we see the new archives that were created in Bamako most recently. And for those of you who have worked in Senegal, this is the old Senegalese National Archives, which is that the reading room is that round component at the front of what used to be called the building administrative. And the location of the archives in this major administrative building, which is also right next to the presidential palace or the governor's palace in Dakar, was significant in showing, again, the importance of archives for governmental authority. But we have to bear in mind that there are essentially two meanings to archives. The first meaning is the building itself, the repository of those archives. And the second is the actual material that's being collected and retained. And these are just examples of how archives are organized and controlled. They're put into these, if resources prevail, they're put into these boxes that help preserve the condition of the archives themselves. But not all archives are as well organized. This picture on the left-hand side is an indication of how prominently archives now in regional locations throughout Africa are being deteriorated. They're at risk. This particular archive on the left-hand side is a regional archive in Kai that one of my colleagues, Marie Rodet, has been working on. She actually got some money to help organize this archive. But the archives themselves represent the state. And these archives then were subject to the animosity of political, anti-government political mobilization, and they were burned down. On the right-hand side, you see archives that are very common, particularly judicial archives that are not organized, that are just bundled, which of course means that they are very hard to work with. So we owe an enormous amount of appreciation to archivists who help organize and maintain the archives themselves. It's important also to know that what is being collected is not everything. Certain things are being thrown out. When I was working in the archives in Bamako, every week the archivist would have a fire on the front lawn where excess documents that the archivist decided were not essential were burned. And of course, historians who come along might have different opinions about that. But the place of archivists in the organizing of this material is very important. But governments also have an interest. And one of the things we've noticed throughout Africa is that, and it's not just Africa, it's also throughout the world, is that many governmental archives have restrictions on access to the most recent archives. In most of Africa, we now have a 30-year rule, which means that the most recent government archives from the past 30 years are not accessible, which makes it very hard, of course, to conduct research on contemporary issues using government archives. But the governments are not the only ones that hold archives. NGOs, non-government organizations, aid organizations, missionaries, churches, mosques, also contain archives. And we have to understand how to use them, how they're organized, and what they contain and what they do not contain. So that brings me to finding aids. One of the most important things in order to use archives and to use the data that are in archives is to understand the systems of classification. And what is important about systems of classification is that they have their own archaeology of knowledge. Many times these systems of classification reflect the organization of governmental institutions. Sometimes they have to do with different departments or organisms. And within those organisms, there's different logic to how they're contained and how they're organized. But they're often organized by date and place, as well as by the institution or the organism being represented. So let me give you an example. This is an example of the archives in Senegal, and we're looking at the AOF Series 2G, which are the reports, the monthly reports, the quarterly reports, the annual reports of governors, administrators, and of district officers that are organized, that were sent from the various locations throughout AOF to the government general, and they were used by the governor general to provide information that then the governor general sends up to Paris and to the Ministry of Colonies. So in looking at this 2G series, let's take a look at 1903. In 1903, the 2G3 series, I'm just taking this as a random example. It just to show you what these archive finding aids are like. So if we look at the 2G series 2G3, it consists of 7 different folders. And the folders are organized under the different colonies. And what we want to do is take a quick look at 2G37. So if you're interested in Senegal and Senegalese history in 1903, you would then ask for this file to be brought to you. And the file itself would consist of this folder. And in this folder, you would have 3 additional sub-files. And this is important because when we cite something in our notes and footnotes, we have to be sure to be able to make traces of where we found the evidence so that we can have other people cross-check what we've done, but also to use what we found as guides to other people conducting research in similar areas. So here we have in file number 1, a question, I took this out on page 25. The very important issue that the colonial government was interested in was to surveil Muslim movements, Islamic movements. And this takes place within the Casamance region, and they're just writing that there's not much going on here. But this just gives you an example of finding aids. And I want to give you one other example from the archives, which I like very much. This is one letter, and what becomes significant about this one letter you find in the archives is that it consists of multiple conversations between different entities. And in this particular letter, the commandant of Medine is proposing a medal of merit for the interpreter Usman Fall. And the rest of it is an engagement of support from different components of the administration supporting this recognition of service. And this just opens the door to understand the important role of African colonial employees in the making of the colonial state. And we can talk about that later if you like. But let me turn next to what I think becomes really important for those of you working with numbers and data. And that is that data and the evidence is never neutral. There is always a bias in the records. And there's always that this bias always shapes what the material in the archives contains. And each organization, whether it's a government bureaucracy, a government employees, NGOs, religious organizations, they each have their own bias. And these biases, understanding what these biases are, become really important in understanding what the documents contain. And each organization has interests in presenting the information in a way that promotes their own interests. So, for example, one of the things that I found so relevant in reading these reports from district officers is that so often they say everything is calm. There's no problem at all in my district. And the reason they do that is because they need to do less work if they say that everything is okay. But we know that everything is not okay. It's just that they're not presenting it that way. So it's really important to understand the nature of the biases. Archivists also, as I've mentioned before, have their own interests. On the one hand, they want to make records accessible, but they also do it within the limits, both political limits and financial limits and legal limits of the organization itself, so that certain pieces of information are not accessible to the general public. And there's certain rules about making these accessible, particularly records relating to individuals. And we can talk about that later as you, when I get to talk a little bit about using court cases. But archivists also operate within the limits of the financial support they get from governments. And so that many archives throughout Africa are in very bad shape and deteriorating. And one of the really important missions that we must have is to be able to digitize these records, to make them more widely, to preserve them and to make them more widely accessible. But the other thing that's important in recognizing about what archivists do is that they give greater, by organizing things in certain orders, they also give greater coherence to the institutions themselves. So the institutions themselves may not have as much coherence as the archives lend themselves in the way in which the material is organized. And this brings us to a series of intellectual perspectives that I would like to share with you. And the first one that I find very useful is James Scott, particularly in a very important book that he called Seeing Like a State. And in that book, he talks about legibility. And what's important is that government officials do not see things on the ground as they're experienced by local inhabitants. So there's a big tension in his argument between state knowledge, which wants to simplify complexities, and local knowledge. And this is really important when you begin to think about why certain development projects fail. They fail in part because state knowledge tends to simplify much more complex understanding of agronomy, of climate, of soils that local inhabitants have. The second argument that I think is really important in shaping the limits of the sources we find in archives is Jeffrey Herbst, who's a political scientist, who talks about broadcasting power. And one of the things that's most common about colonial societies or colonial states is their uneven capacity to broadcast their power spatially, which means that if you're looking at from James Scott's position about legibility and what they can see, they only understand certain areas. where the state is most dense. And there are vast areas that are just not within the purview of the colonial state, or even the post-colonial state for that matter. And that is important because the data that we have reflects that uneven capacity, not only to understand, but also to have a broad overview spatially of what's going on. And third, I want to just briefly allude to Alessandro Stalziani's recent book called The Tensions of Social History, in which he identifies the fact that part of legibility comes in this idea of fixed categories, so that you have workers and peasants, and you have enslaved people, and you have free people. And his argument is that these are unstable categories, that workers become peasants sometimes, they move back and forth. We know that through our understanding of migration patterns, particularly circular migration patterns that happen throughout Africa, where peasants move periodically to sell their labor elsewhere, they're workers, and then they move back and become peasants. So these categories themselves are unstable, and they become much more difficult to use, precisely according to Stanziani, because the archives, colonial archives, are often separated from metropolitan archives. And they're not combined in a way that they have to in order to see the integration of metropolitan and colonial thinking in categories and their particular operation on the ground. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about subaltern studies and Anne Stoley, who focus on this, present this idea of reading against the grain. So that if we know that archives have distortions, how can we use them to our own advantage? And let me give you briefly an example from this book that you now have, The Two Worlds of Cotton. And one of the things I found by reading the official Journal Officiel, which are all the decrees and circulars that are being presented by the colonial government. And one of the things you see is a proliferation of decrees and regulations regarding the cotton market and cotton planting. And you would seem to think that the proliferation of all these decrees and regulations would suggest the colonial state's control over the cotton market and the cotton harvesting, planting. But on the contrary, if you read it against the grain, all these constant regulations, these new regulations, are testimony to the failure of the colonial states to control, and that's the reason why they keep on making new regulations all the time. So let me bring you to a really important thing that I've learned from one of my colleagues at Stanford who works mostly with survey data. And this is where it's really important to think carefully, because we, particularly in the field of quantitative history, but also in terms of quantitative political science and economics, there is this sense that if you have sophisticated mathematical formula, you will be able to have more precise understandings of processes that are going on in the world. But according to my colleague in sociology, it's the quality of the data, not the quality of the mathematical models that are at stake. So if the data are problematic, if the data are garbage, if they have biases that you haven't controlled for, then no matter how sophisticated your analysis, the outcome will also be garbage. And that is an important motto for anyone using numbers and taming numbers to take at heart. And the motto is garbage in, garbage out. So be sure to identify carefully what is truthful or valid within the sources you use. And this is particularly so when you take, for political scientists and economists, when they take ready-made databases off the shelf that someone else had created. It's important to probe what went into those databases before you can really understand what the biases are and what is valid within them. Let me turn briefly to 3 projects that I have worked on regarding quantitative evidence. And the first, you'll know from the 2 worlds of cotton that one of the things that I was interested in the 2 worlds of cotton was understanding both the metropolitan interest in controlling sources of cotton. And you see that on the right-hand side, graph regarding the imports of raw cotton into France itself. And one of the most crucial aspects that shaped French colonial industrial development, but also colonial policy, has to do with the point in the graph around 1860. If you look at that point, you'll see that the imports crash out. It collapsed during the American Civil War because the American cotton harvest was the largest single source of raw cotton on the global market. And that collapse of imports because of the American Civil War resulted in economic distress, factory closures, and worker militancy in France itself, leading to the assertion of socialist political organizations, but also radical politics, all against that. So what the statistical evidence can show you is the convergence of economic data and political realities. Now, if we turn to the left-hand graph, which is the import of industrial yarn, or what in Bamanakan it's called boleti, imported yarn. You also see the significant rise and fall. And what I do in my analysis about this is that it reveals to me some changes that are going on in the household production of handicraft textiles. Because the import of industrial yarn, which is not cloth, but the yarn itself, provided the opportunity to move outside of the household-based, the gender-based organization of labor within the household textile industry. And that was based on the fact that women spun raw cotton into yarn or thread, and the men would weave. But the access to industrial yarn meant that men didn't have to rely on women. And so as these imports came in, the household production unit begins to separate. But the collapse of the imports during World War I then leads to a reconfiguration of these households. And this is part of social history. So this evidence provides a framework to begin to ask new questions about the data. And this is where you begin to understand their points of question that this emerges. And this other chart shows you a similar kind of pattern that goes on with the imports of yarn, but also cloth. So that as cloth is introduced, you don't even need household production, but it too collapses during the World War I. And I trace this also into the Second World War period, into the Depression and into the Second World War, where you have similar declines. And what's important about this, from the argument that I make in Two Worlds of Cotton, is that the handicraft textile industry persists despite the efforts by the French, by metropolitan France and the colonial state to promote development on the export of raw cotton. And of course, Mali becomes one of the world's biggest exporter of cotton in the post-colonial period, only to see its huge position in the world collapse out because of climate change and erosion of the fertility of the soil. Let me turn to my next project for you. And in this project, I do something different than in the previous one. In the previous one, I used archives to help me identify these evidence about imports and exports. But in this project, I'm using the actual registers of entry-level court cases. And I am entering the data myself. So you can see on the right-hand side, the data entry form that I used. And the data entry form cuts off, unfortunately, the date. The date becomes an important part of it. But then I use the actual evidence to identify the type of case and whether there's a secondary case. And that's important. Let me give you an example. I like civil cases as opposed to criminal cases. In criminal cases, the state brings the individual to court. In civil cases, Africans are bringing other Africans to court. So it reveals things about the nature of everyday life that we don't find in other kinds of sources. So these ordinary disputes, and what I'm interested in is the level, not at the village level where no records were kept, but at the level of the Tribunal de Provence. And that's the entry-level disputes, which then can be appealed. But let me give you an example of the coding mechanism I used. So let's say there's a divorce. And the question about the divorce also involves whether there was, with child custody, who gets control of the children. And so that often hinges upon whether bride wealth was paid or not. So the primary case is divorce, and the secondary issue is whether bride wealth was paid or not. And then on the litigant category, I identify whether it's a woman against a man against a man, woman against a woman, just in order to get a gender division of labor. And then I have what I consider to be what's significant about the case, its verdict, and whether there's an appeal or not. So the data entry reflects the actual way in which the evidence is being presented. Now, I did not use names here, in part because the archivist created a rule saying that the use of any evidence regarding personal information is illegal and protected. And so therefore, I chose not to use the individual names. But in order to find the data, we still need, this is again part of the historical methodology, we have to be able to cite the dates that the case was in order for someone else to go through the data and indicate what's going on. So for this project, I used just over 2,000 of these cases. And I did not sample, but I used every single case between 1905, when the native courts were established, to 1912, when these records were changed, when there was a revision as to what the system of these courts looked like. And you can see in the left-hand side, I use 4 districts that I focus on. And I do that in part because the evidence from the court records themselves is revealing of trends, but it doesn't explain why they happened when they did. And that's why these statistical things become then so important. And let me turn to some charts that I use in that project. So in this, in an earlier project, which is in the upper left-hand corner, I did a study on laissez-passer, which are the requests and permissions by individuals to leave a district and move to another one. And I collected the data on those laissez-passer to show when enslaved people left after they begin to leave in 1905. And that big wave of slave exodus, and I know this from previous work, so I know this is going on. So between 1905 and 1912, in different districts, the exodus takes place. And in Gumbu, it begins in 1908, peaks in 1909, continues in 1910, but then is finished. And if you look underneath that, at the graph that I created from the disputes in Gumbu, you'll notice that they also, disputes about debt peak at the same time that the laissez-passer peak. And that becomes fascinating sources of information about the use of data and the context in which they're taking place. So my analysis of debt disputes is that in 1903, the Governor General introduces a new colonial legal system in which one of the principles is that the legal category of a slave no longer exists. So owners cannot go to the colonial officials and ask for the colonial state to return their property. Instead, the owners developed a different strategy, and they wanted to keep their enslaved people working for them by going to courts and putting claims against their former enslaved people about debts, that the former enslaved people owed them labor or property, and this is to entangle them so they don't leave. And then looking at other kinds of data, I looked at divorces, which you see in that middle column on the top. And what becomes interesting about divorces is that I code divorces differently from marriage. Divorces are about the rupture of marriages, and 90+% of all cases brought before these native courts for divorce are brought by women who want a divorce from their husbands, which itself is a fascinating question. But if you look at it, and this is the incidence of these, it seems to be very jagged and jumping all over the place. And it's difficult to see actual patterns that are going on. But if you then divide it by the months in which these divorces take place, you'll see that the largest number of cases occur in April. And why do they occur in April? They occur in April because April is the beginning in Gumbu of the planting season. And now that the enslaved people have left, the household head is turning to his wives and children and making them do work that they hadn't done before. And the women are saying they don't want this. And they're going to court at exactly that moment. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see how I trace out the kinds of complaints that the women are promoting in terms of why they want divorce. And they're essentially peaking in 1909, which is exactly when the enslaved people are leaving, and they're talking about mistreatment. It's at that point, because the enslaved people have left, that the household head is now turning to them, making them work harder than ever before to make up for the lost labor. And the women are saying no, which I find a wonderful testament to the agency of women at this particular moment, which wouldn't be available in other data that are needed. And let me turn to my more recent project, and that is a project that I'm doing together with the Institut d'études avancées at Saint-Louis, with Babacar Fall, but also with the University of Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, together with colleagues in the Loyola Marymount Universities and Stanford, which is to look at the nearly 30,000 cases of enslaved people in Senegal between 1857 and 1903 who asked for their own liberation from colonial officials. And this becomes a record that no one has used before in its detail. And it's something that we've already produced several studies on that become really important in trying to understand what this actually means, what slavery was like, what liberation looked like, what colonial policy looks like. Let me turn to this is this up on the top here is the liberation. This is the registers themselves, and you can see that they're in very bad condition. So one of the things that we have done is to get permission from the archives, first create a microfilm, and then to digitize the microfilm so that we can create enduring digital information. And what we are doing here is to entering the data into Excel forms to make them accessible to anyone who wants to use them. So this is a project in public-facing digital humanity. And we already have several projects, including several publications, but also publications about how to use this in terms of teaching. And one of our colleagues at FASTEF in Cheikh Anta Diop University has already published an example about how useful this information can be in raising the issue of how we can use this information to help raise issues about inequality and hierarchical social structures that persist to this day in Senegal. But you can see the data entry form that we use. We have also gone through the process of beginning to change this as we are trying to think about what is useful to include and what is not useful to include. And the basic data that we have consists of the dates when these individuals sought their own liberation, their ages, their names, where they come from, where they were born, whether they knew their parents or not, what their parents' names were, and whether they traveled in groups or not, and what kind of custody they had, because you can see that there significant range of ages, including minors that are involved. And one of the things we've done is to examine some of this material. So we begin to visualize. This is where this quantitative data becomes so significant. And if you look at the way in which we have identified, we did a preliminary study of 25,000 cases. And you'll see that the number of liberations begins to increase dramatically around the late 1870s, but peaks in 1883. And the question, of course, is what's happening? Why does it peak? Why does it peak in 1883? And it stays elevated after that. And if you go back to the records then, this is where statistical information becomes important, because it raises issues that are important for raising the questions about why things happen when they do. In 1883, from the earlier period from 1857 onward, of course, what happens in 1848 is France abolishes slavery. And it abolishes slavery in Saint Louis and Gorée. And enslaved people are actually liberated in Saint Louis and Gorée. But they also impose a waiting period of 3 months for anyone who comes to touch French soil. As part of 1848 is Article 7, which states that French soil liberates. And part of colonial policy in the 1850s and 60s was to limit the presence of French soil. And that's part of the politics of colonial expansion also in Senegal, and how difficult it was for the French colonial state to expand because it was not interested in territorial expansion. But in 1883, the pressure put on by metropolitan France on the colonial Senegalese administration forced the Senegalese administration to change the waiting period to a week and then to the same day. And in 1883, enslaved people who touch French soil, including the various forts and posts, were granted their liberation certificates at the same day. And that then raises that question about, why this happened when it did. And it also indicates the importance of the grapevine of information that travels among enslaved people who now know they can get their liberation right away. And one of the things that we then decided to do in a most recent paper is to try to study who is traveling together with whom. And we identified out of this pool of data, we identified over 1,000 families traveling together. And in those families, we also could identify what the family consists of. And this is something we don't know. We don't have any information about what enslaved families look like. But these enslaved families seeking their liberation actually are revealed in the parent gender distribution on the bottom of the left-hand side. 90+ plus percent of these households that are traveling together, these families that are traveling together, are headed by women, and they do not have male household heads. And we know that because the children are given, their custody of the children are given to the mothers or the fathers. So that's our indication. Our other indication is about the intentionality of what is happening by looking at the Liberation Month. And what we see happening there is just like we saw with the divorce cases in Gumbu, is that there's a seasonality that fits the agricultural cycle, that most of the liberations occur just before the planting season, so that the enslaved people who want their liberation are intentionally leaving in order to begin planting in time for the new planting season. So this is what I just wanted to show you about how useful these numbers can be in raising questions about everyday life, particularly how ordinary Africans are living the big changes that are happening through colonialism. Few of those are intentional, most of those are unintentional by the colonial state. That creates the opportunity for Africans to have their own agency. So I thank you, and I turn this back over to Beatrice and Babacar. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup vraiment pour cette présentation. Alors que je vais essayer en français de reprendre les principaux traits. Vous en avez besoin ou pas, ça? Bon. Alors rapidement, et puis bon, si je suis complètement à côté, il faudra vraiment m'arrêter. Désolée. Alors voilà, moi, je vous suis très, très, très reconnaissante d'avoir commencé par la présentation des matériaux, du matériel en fait qui nous unit, c'est-à-dire d'avoir consacré un long moment à la présentation des archives. Alors, ça n'est pas seulement une présentation très rapide, mais c'est une présentation, disons, que vous avez très bien, à mon sens, matérialisée. C'est-à-dire que vous nous avez montré des photos des archives, donc des archives vraiment dans leur situation, en particulier bon, à Bamako, mais aussi les archives du Sénégal, les archives nationales du Sénégal, dans ce beau bâtiment qui était l'ancien service administratif des archives. Ça a un petit peu changé, s'il y en a qui sont allés, hein, c'est dans un centre commercial. Je vous signale que l'escalier mécanique est en panne depuis quelques mois. Bon, alors, et c'est très intéressant parce que c'est d'autant plus intéressant que vous avez bien souligné que la conservation des archives était une façon pour l'État, pour les États, quelque part, de se mettre en scène. C'est aussi, on avait parlé des chiffres comme un éventuel devoir de souveraineté, on peut dire. Bon, les archives, c'est la même chose. L'état des archives peut être le signe de la façon dont l'État, les États se mettent en scène. C'est sûr qu'avoir des archives très bien, et vos deux, trois photos sur la qualité des archives, quand on voit une diapositive à gauche, c'était un fatras épouvantable, le plus grand désordre. Ces archives, merci pour ce cliché, parce que c'est évident que ces archives, celles de gauche, ne seront jamais, jamais, jamais inventoriées. Et du coup, elles constituent une perte sèche pour l'historien, pour les États aussi, pour les archivistes. Hein. Alors, je ne sais pas s'il s'agit d'archives nationales, s'il s'agit d'archives d'entreprises, d'archives d'associations. Vous nous avez parlé aussi, vous avez insisté sur la diversité des archives. Les archives, par exemple, des congrégations religieuses, des églises. Et ça, je vous en remercie aussi parce qu'on peut avoir tendance à penser qu'il y a des archives nationales et puis le reste non. Mais en réalité, si certaines archives sont en déshérence, comme vous le montrez dans le cliché de gauche, je crois que je vais m'endormir avec cette diapositive dans la tête. Bon, il y en a d'autres qui sont au contraire, hein, qui sont bien valorisées et qui sont bien conservées. Donc ça, je crois que pour nous, c'est très important de pouvoir voir les archives dans leur matérialité. Et du coup, les historiens que nous sommes peuvent prétendre à un moment ou à un autre faire pression pour essayer d'obtenir des archives dans de bonnes conditions. Enfin, voilà, nous on parle ici beaucoup d'archives qui sont des archives disponibles en Afrique. Euh, Vous avez des archives qui ont vécu, alors bon là je fais une petite aparté, mais qui ont vécu, qui ont survécu sous les bombes. Je fais référence en particulier aux archives du Vietnam. Vietnam qui a été bombardé, napalmé pendant 20, 30 ans. Les archives du Vietnam ont été conservées dans des grottes. Elles ont été sauvées d'abord, puis conservées dans des grottes. Et résultat, aujourd'hui, ces archives sont accessibles toutes, vous en avez parlé aussi, de la numérisation, elles sont toutes accessibles sur support informatique. Donc là, on voit qu'il y a, c'était pour l'État, enfin, il se constituait, mais pour l'État vietnamien, il y a un enjeu patriotique absolument essentiel derrière la conservation de ces archives qui sont désormais accessibles dans les 4 centres d'archives nationales du Vietnam. Voilà, donc ce combat qu'il peut y avoir derrière les archives et qu'il y a derrière les archives, je vous remercie de le souligner parce que nous, comme usagers, disons, comme clients des archives, on n'y pense peut-être pas suffisamment. Bon, et voilà, c'est très bien de commencer par là. Enfin, moi, j'ai trouvé que c'était très, très bien. Je vous remercie aussi de nous avoir montré une photo de 1910, l'ancien centre des archives. C'était Koulouba. J'ai noté l'importance du lieu et l'importance du lieu qui n'est pas que le lieu des 10 dernières années, mais qui est aussi, alors avec tout ce que vous avez dit par la suite, j'y reviendrai, mais qui est aussi un lieu de conservation des archives coloniales. Alors, vous nous avez aussi très bien montré et pointé à plusieurs reprises, avant de nous présenter vos 3 travaux les plus récents, vous nous avez vraiment bien souligné, je crois, c'était quoi que je voulais dire, l'importance des archives et aussi les biais des archives. On en a beaucoup. À plusieurs reprises, on a abordé entre nous, dans différentes communications, justement, les biais des archives et tout particulièrement les biais des archives coloniales qui sont fabriquées par des administrations coloniales pour les archives des administrations et qui sont fabriquées par des administrations coloniales. Donc ça, merci beaucoup parce que ça fait écho à plusieurs de nos, disons des limites que l'on a pu souligner dans nos propres travaux. À chaque fois, ces biais sont des éléments importants. Bon. Vous avez montré aussi, et ça, on reconnaît tous, vous pointez l'universalité finalement des archives qui nous relient tous, que l'on soit au nord, au sud, à l'est, à l'ouest, quelle que soit la position par rapport à l'équateur, ces archives sont conservées dans les fameux cartons pochards. Enfin bon, bref, vous nous avez montré ça, c'est-à-dire des cartons qui sont en principe destinés à, disons, préserver des champignons, du feu et de l'eau. Donc là aussi, il y a une universalité et je pense que c'est ce qui nous relie, nous, historiens, puisque nous fréquentons ces archives. Donc c'est très intéressant pour nous de savoir que vous basez, enfin on s'en doutait, mais que vous fondez vos travaux sur ces différents types d'archives. Vous avez aussi très bien, à mon avis, souligné les différences entre des archives qui peuvent être des archives, alors moi je dis archives publiques, mais les archives des administrations, et des archives qui ne sont pas des administrations. Et puis, j'ai été contente de retrouver un document que j'ai regardé la semaine dernière, c'est un inventaire qui est disponible aux Archives nationales du Sénégal. Je crois qu'il n'y a pas que les archives que vous mettez en valeur, mais il y a aussi les archivistes, avec cette couverture de l'inventaire de la série 2G aux Archives nationales du Sénégal, là, et qui est un inventaire signé d'Abdoulaye Gambé Ndiaye, le rôle des archivistes quand ils font les inventaires. Et ça, c'est un élément absolument fondamental parce que derrière l'inventaire, il y a la reconnaissance d'archives, bon, mais il y a aussi le classement. Et c'est à partir de ces inventaires, c'est à partir de ces classements que nous pouvons tous, vous l'avez dit, c'est pas forcément facile, mais on peut, une fois qu'on comprend comment ça fonctionne, on peut se référer du coup à ces archives. Et là, je crois qu'on a du coup, historien, un langage commun qui est celui finalement de l'ensemble des inventaires. Pour nous, c'est une espèce de dictionnaire qui me paraît très très importante. Voilà. Alors, vous nous avez aussi montré l'importance de documents sur lesquels on a un petit peu travaillé. Ce sont, parce qu'on a travaillé sur un certain nombre d'articles, des rapports. Des rapports, là, vous avez montré les rapports politiques du Bas-Sénégal. Il y en a d'autres, vous l'avez bien dit. Les rapports politiques du Bas-Sénégal. Bon, et puis vous nous avez montré par le menu que l'on pouvait trouver. Ce qui vous a marqué et ce qui nous marque tous, c'est quand on trouve finalement, quand on prend la main de celui qui a été l'auteur du papier. Et votre papier, la feuille que vous montrez avec les gribouillis, parce qu'on n'a pas pu voir beaucoup, mais vous avez le rapport en haut, tout petit, un commentaire, et puis en dessous, on a deux, trois commentaires qui sont des espèces de tartines manuscrites. Bon, ça c'est intéressant parce que c'est beaucoup plus vivant, en fait, quand on trouve un document de ce type que quand on trouve des documents qui sont imprimés. Voilà. Et vous nous montrez aussi les limites de ces documents, bien entendu, puisque ces documents sont partiels, on ne les trouve pas tous forcément, et partiaux aussi, pour les raisons que j'ai déjà évoquées. Alors, merci aussi d'avoir mis en scène précisément, de nous avoir présenté vos projets. Alors, pour les cotons, et surtout l'usage des chiffres, l'usage de la quantification dans vos différents approches, vos projets les plus récents. Et bon, pour le coton, on a votre ouvrage. Vous avez montré qu'il était absolument essentiel, quand on fait des courbes, de préciser pourquoi il y a des creux, des bosses, des trous. Bon, et là, on en avait aussi discuté entre nous. Vous voyez, là, nous avons eu vraiment une présentation d'une honnêteté par rapport au traitement qualitatif, pas qualitatif, par rapport au traitement quantitatif des documents, une honnêteté qui n'a pas d'égal. Je vous avais dit qu'entre 14 et 18, il pouvait ne rien y avoir. Et bien là, au contraire, vous pointez, disons, les différences, les manques. Et ça, pour nous, c'est très intéressant. Vous montrez aussi, alors pour vos différents projets, ce que j'ai noté, je ne vais pas monopoliser la parole, mais vous montrez aussi qu'à partir de dossiers qui peuvent paraître complètement anodins, mais en réalité qui sont très difficiles à travailler, je fais référence aux archives judiciaires. Pour travailler sur des archives judiciaires et en particulier pour travailler sur des archives, disons, qui ne sont pas celles des chambres criminelles, mais qui sont celles des tribunaux ordinaires, il faut consacrer un temps absolument fou. Parce que vous avez énormément de dossiers, vous nous en avez montré un papier, bon, une source, mais si vous voulez, et ce que vous avez fait par exemple, ce qui m'a marqué, moi, c'est votre schéma avec la fréquence, l'analyse des divorces en fonction du mois. Bon, pour constituer ce document-là, il vous a fallu, je ne sais pas combien de temps, mais sans doute passer énormément de temps dans les dossiers parce que vous avez repris, sauf si je me trompe, mais je ne vois pas comment vous avez fait sinon, ça suppose de reprendre tous les dossiers du tribunal ou des tribunaux et de reconstituer, vous avez mis ça dans une base de données, on a travaillé les bases de données, nous c'était sur la poste en Algérie et les postiers et les postières, justement il n'y a pas de postiers mais bon, vous avez fait vraiment l'atelier en fait sur lequel on a travaillé, nous c'était avant-hier, mais ceci suppose en amont, nous on l'avait vu de notre côté à petite échelle, mais ceci suppose en amont un travail de titan pour aller extraire chacune des informations que vous allez mettre dans votre base de données. Donc voilà, donc vous nous montrez que l'approche quantitative et que les représentations graphiques supposent un temps fou, et ça je vous en remercie, parce qu'on a tendance en fait à penser que la construction d'une base de données est une fin en soi, qu'elle se fera facilement et on ne dispose pas d'équipes de chercheurs qui nous permettent de faire ça. Donc voilà, vos deux derniers graphiques, les graphiques sur lesquels vous finissez là, la répartition des enfants, femmes, hommes et la répartition des familles. On voit avec cette très faible représentation finalement des hommes le dernier petit camembert, là, nous apporte des informations très, très intéressantes hein, sur la libération, hein, et sur tout. Alors, pas sur la libération, ça c'était la donnée de base, mais sur les esclaves, en réalité, hein, sur ce qu'étaient des esclaves, et là, dans une très moindre mesure, mais sur leur devenir. Donc, évidemment, enfin, pas évidemment, mais merci pour tout ça, parce que je crois que pour nous qui travaillons sur le chiffre, même si on l'oublie parfois dans nos présentations, vous nous avez donné une parfaite illustration à la fois de ce que l'on peut faire en approche quantitative et de ce qu'il ne faut pas faire, parce que justement, vous avez contourné tous les écueils, hein, et puis vous nous soulignez aussi de façon très très claire la difficulté en fait, mais ça, la difficulté du travail, hein, du quantitativiste quand il veut reconstituer des séries, et aussi la richesse de ce type d'approche. Donc merci beaucoup. Je vais passer la parole à la salle s'il y a des questions, à moins que vous vouliez faire des commentaires. En tout cas, je vous salue et vous remercie vraiment de votre disponibilité.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Félicitations. Je voulais donc, à la suite de professeur Béatrice, saluer votre sagacité archivistique. J'ai vu combien vous avez croisé, comparé, triangulé les archives du Sénégal, bref, du Soudan français, et vous avez mis l'accent sur la série G. C'est vrai que nous, historiens, notre premier matériau, ce sont les archives, et pratiquement nous maîtrisons l'ensemble des codes avec l'alphabet de A à Z. Vous avez mis l'accent sur la série G, surtout les rappels périodiques, la série de G, qui relate des aspects parce qu'il y a des rapports trimestriels, mensuels et même annuels. Vous l'avez mentionné dans votre livre, surtout la série R par rapport aux affaires agricoles. Je m'attendais à ce qu'on mette un peu l'accent sur la série R, d'autant plus que le livre nous parle du coton. Il y en a qui travaillent sur le caoutchouc. Et j'ai vu dans les classiques Mamoudou Diouf qui a travaillé sur l'arachide. Et moi, je suis sur la gomme. En tout cas, je m'attendais à voir véritablement des archives beaucoup plus sur la série L, R du moins. Et avec l'esclavage, il y a aussi la série 4. Mais sur le problème des divorces que vous avez soulevé, il y a une seule, à ma connaissance, au département d'histoire, qui a travaillé sur ces divorces-là, et qui s'appelle Awayomiat, et qui a travaillé sur la série M, la série N, sur les affaires judiciaires. Mais si je sais de très près votre ouvrage sur le textile, véritablement, si on mettait l'accent sur la série R, ça pouvait véritablement nous servir. Mais en parcourant votre ouvrage, on s'est rendu compte qu'il y a eu donc deux mondes, comme vous le dites, du coton. Et heureusement, nous avons compris quand même, en lisant votre livre, qu'à la suite des guerres napoléoniennes, la France avait une autre préoccupation pour exploiter le coton qui a été concurrencé par les textiles des États-Unis d'Amérique. Je vais aller vite pour ne pas monopoliser la parole, mais ce que je retiens surtout, c'est avec votre borne chronologique sur 1946, avec véritablement l'abolition du travail forcé. Ça a coïncidé aussi avec la chute de la production agricole du coton au niveau de l'Afrique. Et là, on comprend véritablement cette main-d'œuvre qu'utilisait véritablement le pouvoir colonial pour développer ce coton-là. Je pense que je m'arrête là pour le moment. So thank you for the presentation. My name is Emmanuel Jesse. I was so impressed by the presentation. So without much ado, I have some few questions concerning what you say. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So I have three questions, maybe even four. So the first question goes thus: what is the impact of numbers in the process of colonization of Africa? I repeat, what is the impact of numbers in the process of colonization of Africa? The second question, can we quantify the disaster caused by slave trade in Africa? Can we quantify the disaster caused by slave trade in Africa? Or it is just an imagination? And my last question is just about a statement that you made. You said each organization has their own interests, or the people in charge of collecting information, they has their own interests. This is a statement that we read from the projection that you did. My question is, if it is the case, can we say that the production of numbers is in Africa is corrupted? If each organization has its own interests in the process of the production of numbers, can we say that the production of numbers in Africa is corrupted? Those are my questions. I can come earlier again. Thanks.
Bonsoir, professeur. Merci pour votre présentation. Mon anglais n'est pas vraiment au top. Il serait mieux de parler en français pour que les échanges soient plus clairs. Euh, j'ai feuilleté vos ouvrages, j'ai aussi écouté votre présentation. Oui, je me nomme Saïd Peyou Suleiman, doctorant à l'université de Douala au Cameroun. Je travaille sur les questions foncières. Donc, mon thème, c'est accès à la terre et conflits agraires dans le Congo. Donc, ce travail intègre les conflits liés aux problèmes agricoles. Donc, votre travail, votre ouvrage, c'est une mine d'or pour moi parce que ça m'a permis aussi de voyager dans d'autres cieux, essayer de faire une étude comparée entre la politique coloniale française en AOF et celle en AEF. Je voudrais savoir comment la France a implémenté sa politique dans un territoire comme le Togo ou le Cameroun, qui ont été des territoires hérités après la Première Guerre mondiale. Est-ce que la politique qu'elle a implantée dans d'autres territoires de l'AOF, est-ce la même politique qu'elle a implantée aussi dans un territoire comme le Togo? Et le cas du Togo, le cas du Cameroun, je voudrais savoir. Merci.
Thank you. Good morning, Professor. My name is Nyanki, a PhD candidate at the University of Antananarivo, Madagascar. My question is for about your books. You said that the main object of the books is to demonstrate the French French administration not failed in cotton business. And my question is to know if they are recognized that they are failed in this administration of cotton business. Thank you.
Could you please repeat your question?
Pardon. Oui, on n'a pas, oui. Pardon.
My question is, did the French administration or recognized that they are failed in the cotton business?
Oh.
Thanks, Professor, for your presentation. I am Nyan Jemen. I have one question about the relationship. You begin your introduction about the bigger change, the big change in the world, like capitalism, slavery, and colonialism. I want to know what the relationship with all this change and the cotton productions in the southern Africa. Thanks.
Me too, I have a question. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Alexandre Baïf. I'm a PhD student in the University of Patanamaric, Madagascar. I have three questions. My first question is, do you think that there is a generation gap on the use of a number? Because when I read our program, it's the title of the program. So I ask the question, do you think that there is generation gap on the use of the number? The second question is, what is the reason of the choice of French, Sudan, and Senegal? There is a personal choices, or what is your interest in this, in the case of the tools also? And my third question is, you work in a slavery project now, and I want to know what type of slave did you reference? A slave from the slave trade or a domestical slave? Thank you.
Evening, Professor. My name is Maimuna Christian. I'm a PhD student, and I'm working on loincloths in the major areas of Cameroon. Introduction, appropriation, and functionalities from the 19th to the 21st century. And you can realize that it is really a great opportunity for me to speak with you, to change with you, and to read this book in front of me. So it's true that my English is not very well, but I will try to do my best. So I have some questions, some interrogation, and so on, so that you can guide me if I'm so confused. Okay, the first one is that you are started by saying that it is important to identify what it is true in the data that we are collecting in the archives. And I'm insisting on this in this case because you have said that you have taken the case of that book, Two Words of Cotton. and you specify the type of archive or archives that you use. And I'm talking about it because in my work, when I was collecting my data, I realized that there are some archives, okay, archives that are showing contradiction with others' archives concerning the way that the colonial administration was selling their fabrics. Because the first one was showing that the fabrics were the most important product selling by colonial administration, and the other one was showing the contradiction. And I'm also insisting in this case because we realized that there was important local textile activities, because there was some waivers, there was different room that was that was producing some fabrics, local fabrics in northern Cameroon, and that was the reason that these colonial fabrics have not been have not uh, have not been very well sold in Cameroon. That's the first question. So that I don't know if it's the question or if you can guide me concerning this topic. And the first one, the second one, you were talking about um, okay, between 19, I saw in one graphic, between 1999 and 1915, the graphic shows the import of clothes and yam in French Sudan. And I saw that in 1913, it collapsed. So the import of fabrics collapsed during this period. And in this Sudan Français, I wanted to know what was the reason of this change, because in Cameroon, when I was collecting the data, I realized that the import of these fabrics was increasing, So that I also want you to help me concerning the introduction of cotton in our society. Because when I read some document, they show that the introduction of cotton, the history of this introduction or the origin are not clear. Someone are talking about Senegal, which is from Senegal or from West Africa, that they introduced cotton, or yes, that they introduced cotton. But there are some documents that shows that in northern Cameroon, before colonialization, before the influence of Islam, there were some societies who was producing this cotton. So that I wanted to know if maybe you have some information to guide me concerning the origin of cotton in northern Cameroon, principally because it is by the northern Cameroon that the introduction of cotton has been made in our societies. I also have some questions, but I will let my colleagues to continue first. The time for me to add it.
Quelqu'un d'autre? Oui. Allô?
Merci, Monsieur Travers, de nous avoir fait cette belle présentation. Merci aussi pour les ouvrages que vous avez bien voulu mettre à notre disposition. J'en suis vraiment très ravi, d'autant plus que j'aurais dû commencer par là. Mon nom c'est Alun Bay. En fait, j'ai fait un mémoire de maîtrise et un DEA à l'université de Charles de Gaulle et qui porte sur les maisons de commerce. C'est avec intérêt que j'ai parcouru votre ouvrage et j'ai pu, comment dirais-je, constater, n'est-ce pas, un peu la trajectoire de l'État colonial et notamment les différentes politiques qui se sont succédées. Ce qui m'intéresse particulièrement, c'est en fait que vous avez parlé dans votre ouvrage de l'expérience de la en fait, de l'économie de plantation. Parce qu'en fait, la France a un peu tergiversé entre l'économie de plantation et la vocation commerciale. Et, dans votre ouvrage, vous parlez de l'expérience qui a été mise en place par le baron Roger à Richard Toll, n'est-ce pas, qui voulait effectivement faire de cette zone une zone de plantation. Et on sait effectivement, malheureusement, cette expérience a échoué. Et donc, après l'échec de cette plantation, de cette économie de plantation, n'est-ce pas, le Sénégal a eu une vocation commerciale. Voilà. On sait également qu'il y a en fait, à un moment donné, un basculement de l'économie du nord vers le bassin arachidier. La question que je me pose, au moment où l'économie sénégalaise était en crise, parce que confrontée à un double problème, la crise de la gomme et l'abolition de l'esclavage, n'est-ce pas, il était question de trouver un produit de substitution. Et il a fallu attendre 1840 pour qu'un Français du Nord, Jobert, n'est-ce pas, fasse la première exportation d'arachide en France. Ma préoccupation est la suivante. D'autant plus que le Soudan français avait axé son économie de rente sur le coton. Comment le Soudan français a vécu cette période? Au moment où, par exemple, il y avait crise de la gomme, crise crise de la gomme et abolition de l'esclavage. Pourquoi est-ce que les Français, à un moment donné, ont pensé étendre, par exemple, l'économie cotonnière qui, n'est-ce pas, caractérisait le Soudan français dans le contexte sénégalais? Voilà, cette période d'errance, cette période de tâtonnement, du passage de la crise de la gomme et de l'abolition de l'esclavage, comment ça a été vécu, n'est-ce pas, dans le contexte du Soudan français? Je vous remercie.
Des questions. Il y a des questions dans le chat aussi.
Des questions?
Oui. Alors, Morphal, tu veux donner ou sinon? Voilà, et dans la discussion, je ne sais pas si vous voyez, you want to know what contemporary lessons can be drawn from the study of the colonial cotton economic for development policy in West Africa today. You see in the chat, I don't know. And other questions are before. Les autres, on les avait posés. Les autres,
Good evening, Professor. It's better for me to speak in French. Je me nomme Rostand Bession, étudiant à l'Université de Yaoundé. J'ai un peu parcouru votre ouvrage de monde du coton, au colonialisme et l'économie régionale dans l'Occident français 1800-1946. Dernièrement, je lisais un article qui portait sur la transformation du coton au nord du Cameroun et je me suis rendu compte que le coton représentait une mine d'or pour le développement économique du Cameroun, notamment avec la transformation des graines de coton en huile diamant. J'aimerais donc savoir ce que les Français faisaient de ces graines de coton-là. Est-ce que ils utilisaient juste le coton pour le textile ou alors il y avait d'autres transformations parallèles? Merci.
Proposer au micro. Proposer au micro.
Merci, professeur, pour votre présentation. Merci également pour le don de cet ouvrage très riche en données. J'aimerais savoir, je me nomme Aïssatou Soïbou, je suis enseignante à l'université de Yaoundé au Cameroun, je suis postdoctorante. Ce qui m'intéresse, c'est la place de la femme dans cette culture cotonnière. Quelle place est-ce qu'elle a eu à occuper dans la culture cotonnière au Soudan et au Sénégal? Je constate, c'est un constat, hein. La femme, elle joue, je pense, un rôle très important en milieu rural, surtout dans le domaine agricole. Elle constitue même d'œuvre pour elle constitue une forte main d'œuvre, mais le constat, c'est que dans l'histoire, elle est oubliée. Les femmes sont les oubliées de l'histoire. Pourtant, hein, sur toute la chaîne de production, elles interviennent. Mais lorsqu'il faut parler de ces activités agricoles, dans la plupart des cas, elles sont oubliées. Elles ont intervenu à quel niveau? Quel rôle est-ce qu'elles ont eu à jouer? Est-ce qu'elles ont eu à jouer un rôle dans la réponse à la riposte sur l'exploitation cotonnière industrielle? Où je n'arrive pas vraiment à identifier la place vraiment de ces femmes. Merci.
Professor is Maimuna again. I wanted to add two questions. And the first one is concerning the inventory of local fabrics during the colonial period that have not been really done by local colonial administration. Because in northern Cameroon, for example, there was so many daring, there were so many waivers that was producing local textile. But during this period, when I'm collecting some data, I've not seen this inventory. And the other question is concerning the colonial exposition, such as one that you have mentioned in your book, Two Words of Cotton, the international, the colonial exposition of 1931. That so many people, such as in Cameroon, have taken part of this in this exposition, and I wanted to know the effects of this colonial exposition in the local production of fabrics in our societies in Cameroon, for example, because I saw it in the book concerning Sudan Français, but I wanted to do a link between with Cameroon. Thank you.
Yeah, finish. Ah, Carole, last one. Oui, le micro, ce serait bien. Alors, du coup, Carole, ça sera la dernière. Après.
Merci, professeur, pour cette présentation. Je me nomme Aouni Zampa Carole Noël, étudiante à l'Université de Yaoundé 1 et je travaille sur les politiques de désendettement des pays africains. J'ai parcouru vos ouvrages hier et il y a une portion qui m'a intéressée. La portion qui m'a intéressée, c'est la commercialisation du coton. Vous avez mentionné que le coton se commercialisait beaucoup plus au niveau local avant les années 1946. J'ai étudié dans ma thèse la crise de la dette. Et l'une des causes de la crise de la dette a été
L'une des causes des crises de la dette a été la chute drastique des coûts des matières premières. Et parmi les matières premières, on avait le coton. J'aimerais savoir à quel moment la commercialisation du coton est entrée sur la scène internationale pour qu'on arrive à cette chute drastique dans les années 80 et à une crise de la dette enfin.
Une vraiment dernière question. Chez Saïd.
Saïd, Université de Douala. Je voudrais savoir si l'introduction de la culture de coton en AOF a créé une marchandisation foncière à outrance dans cette région, donc avec tout ce qui peut résulter comme retombées, conflits fonciers et autres. Merci.
Voilà, on a fait le tour. Et bon, alors, avec les questions du chat qui sont souvent transcrites, donc voilà, ça va peut-être faciliter. Je vous laisse la parole.
Well, thank you all very much for your questions. Thank you for listening to me. And thank you for those probing questions about evidence, about sources, about different locations in Francophone Africa, about various ways in which we can reconstruct the impact of colonialism and the place of numbers within that issue. So let me thank you again for the questions, and let me try to answer some of them. Let's begin with those questions regarding agriculture. So one of the questions in the chat has to do with the importance of the series, the classification series R, which is agriculture. So what I showed you is the classification only on the 2G series, the political aspects. But the classification series themselves, which is why you have to, when you begin working in archives, you have to begin to spend time learning about the different, what's in the different classifications. The classification R has to do with agriculture and agricultural change. And that then stems from the bureaucratic ministry or colonial ministry of agriculture. And what becomes important is that those records are also organized by date and by place. So the really important thing to do is when you begin to work in archives, you can't just look at one classification series, but you have to cast your net, your research perspective among all the different classification series for that particular area and time you're looking at, which is the only way you can bring together the different perspectives. Certain perspectives are being left out of political reports. The agricultural reports will leave out political aspects. They'll leave out the judicial aspects. So it's important to be able to look as broadly as you can into these different inventories. But not everything is inventoried. And that comes back down to that perspective I raised at the beginning regarding the bias in the sources about broadcasting power, the Jeffrey Herbst argument. There are many areas of colonies that are virtually unknown to the colonial administration. And therefore, we have to be much more creative in thinking about how to use sources, say, from the Northern Cameroon, if there are not enough adequate sources. And the same thing would occur in different areas where the colonial, Northern Togo, for example, where the colonial presence is much more limited. But that equally plays an important role in terms of the impact of industrially produced yarn and textiles. Because in different parts of colonies, you will have a different impact on the presence of these different elements. And in the Two Worlds of Cotton book, I propose an argument about consumption, which is worth thinking about. And I call textile consumption an inexpensive luxury. In other words, when the economic conditions are good, prices are low for imported textiles, and when peasants receive significant money for their crops, then they can acquire more textiles. When conditions are bad, when the cost of imported textiles goes up, when it's scarce, or when the peasants do not receive enough adequate funds for their crops, then they do without buying these inexpensive luxuries. So cloth consumption in itself is a dependent variable. One of the questions that was also asked was whether or not we don't pay enough attention to the role of women in textile production. And that's actually important if we think about the gender division of labor. In producing handicraft textiles, women's work was crucially important in two different ways. Women were in charge of cleaning the cotton, taking the seeds out of the cotton, and in spinning them, making the cotton into the yarn that then men would weave. That's the reason why I showed you the chart on the imported yarn, because it broke apart that kind of complementarity. But one of the other things we've learned is that as the French begin to introduce new varieties of cotton with longer staple, because those have higher prices on the world market, and they are attractive for metropolitan producers. Long staple cotton is also very attractive to women because they can spin it finer. And so when the French establish a very complicated public-private relationship with the French textile industry. And they create this entity called the Association Cotonnière Coloniale, which is charged by the colonial state and the metropolitan industry with introducing improved varieties of cotton and introducing also industrially ginning machines. It's because the French, when imported cotton, they want the cotton to be cleaned before it arrives so that it can be taken immediately on its arrival to the factories and then spun. So the Association Cotonnière Coloniale played a very important role in the development of the colonial project of developing cotton. But in places like northern Cameroon, places like Mali, the imports did not destroy the handicraft industry because the imports never persisted long enough. They increased they increased just before World War I, they collapsed, and they increased in the 1920s to collapse again during the Depression, and they increased again just before World War II and collapsed again. And it's the failure of persistent imports of industrial textile that allowed for the persistence of the handicraft textile industry. And even to this day, the handicraft textile industry persists because it caters to an elite or niche market. But that is a different story. So there was a question also about the origins of cotton. I talk a little bit about the origins of the cotton in this book I wrote on the 2 rows of cotton, that cotton has a very long history in Africa, that for millennia predate the arrival of colonialism. It has different periods when it expands, particularly because with the coming of Islam, there's also concern with greater modesty. And so textiles begin to play a role there as well. So I want to mention also that one of the reasons there was a question about whether the French realized that they failed in their project to develop cotton. And I think they realized that certain things failed and they tried new things continuously. And one of the things we didn't talk about, of course, is the Office de Niger. The Office de Niger was a huge project to create irrigated cotton in order to sustain the perennial production of cotton that didn't depend on rainfall. And that allowed for cotton production to be particularly grown in the Sahel region. That failed. It failed in part because the irrigation process was too costly in terms of lives lost in the building process, too costly because the cotton did not thrive as well as the French thought. And it also, the collapse of the Office de Niger coincided with the Green Revolution that takes place in the period after the Second World War, where increased fertilizer and increased hybrid seeds allowed for the dramatic expansion of cotton in the lower savanna region of the Côte d'Ivoire and southern Mali in particular. And those regions become incredibly important for the growth of cotton production in the period after the Second World War. The other thing about cotton that becomes so important for the colonial experience has to do with the violence of colonial supervision. Because the French metropolitan industry was very concerned with mixing varieties of cotton. And cotton is susceptible to hybridity. So if this longer staple cotton is grown next to local short staple cotton, then they produce hybrid varieties that are no longer in such demand for industrial spinning. And I should mention that the thing about industrial spinning is there's a technology involved, that the machines are calibrated for certain lengths of fiber. And if you have uneven fiber, the machines break down. So that interferes with the productivity of industrial manufacturing. So quality becomes a very important aspect. There was a question also about slavery. So many of the slaves, for example, there's several questions about slavery, but let me explore some of them. Many of the enslaved people that we find in the liberation records in Senegal are recently enslaved. They come from the warrior states of Samari and Picasso and Al-Hajj Umar, and these warrior states emerge in the second half of the 19th century, when the Atlantic slave trade is already closed off, but there's still significant demand for enslaved people throughout West Africa. And one of the things that we are tracing is that it's quite likely that the conditions of these newly enslaved people from the 1860s, 70s, 1880s, and 90s, the conditions of their livelihoods deteriorate as more enslaved people entered the domestic households. And this contributes to increased inequality, increased social stratification that we see among the various statuses that happen in Senegal itself that articulates inequality. And many of these enslaved people then are learning about the possibility of escape, and they take advantage of that because they're not content to be in their condition, even if they don't live in plantations. They live in households, but they still have significant interests. One of the things we found by tracing the families, the enslaved families who leave, is that often you see that in the graph, there are more girls than boys. It could very well be that mothers are interested in controlling their daughters' fates rather than leaving them with their owners' fates. So they are, we of course don't have enough evidence about this, but it's suggestive. There was a question about what impact whether we can use the slave trade database, the slave voyages database, to make assessments of the impact of the slave trade on African societies. And there have been many attempts to do that. In part, one of the things that the slave trade voyages database can do is to identify the origins, the points of embarkation on slave ships. But we don't know where those slaves come from. They don't come from just the point where they're embarked on the slave ship. They come from the interior too. So it's difficult to trace out exactly what the impacts are. But it's clear that people have tried to make an assessment as to what impact the slave trade had, the export of millions of men and women on African society. And a couple of things that we know is that more men were exported than women. So more female slaves were retained in Africa, which may have contributed to the growth of patriarchy in African societies, as more men acquired enslaved women to increase the size of their households. The other thing that students who have looked at this have said is that one of the consequences of the slave trade has been an increase in distrust among different groups. So that one of the reasons post-colonial Africa has seen such political instability is precisely because of the distrust that was created because of the slave trade, because the slave trade always involves the enslavement of people from other communities. So is there a way of thinking about how numbers can be used? We have to be careful about how numbers can be used because of the biases that we've talked about before. And we have to identify what those biases may be. We also have to recognize that in that picture I showed about garbage in and garbage out, we have to be very careful about the quality of the data. No matter how sophisticated, and this comes to the generational concern with quantitative data. Quantitative data can provide for an appearance of more scientific rigor, but we have to be careful that we're using good data, not garbage. And that becomes a burden that's placed on the scholars, the researchers, to make clear what the quality of the data are. So I'm sure there are many more questions that I haven't gotten around to, but I thank you for your questions. I thank you for listening to me, and I wish you great productivity and continued conversation in your ongoing time together in San Luis. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Many thanks. And many thanks for all the students who are here for 2 weeks. And we'll speak about your conference, I think, tomorrow, after tomorrow, and after tomorrow, because it is very, very rich. Many thanks for you. Babacar, tu veux?
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Roberts, for this very fruitful conversation. For this very fruitful conversation. I'm quite sure that all the students, we get to be more familiarized with your work, especially reading your book, The Word of Cotton. We'll take this case as a very demonstrative way of the place and the role numbers can be used in their work, in their own projects. We really appreciate the large ranks of case, such as the 3 cases you showed from to Word of Cotton, the disputes, the divorce in the Sudan, and the project on Senegalese liberation slavery. I think these 3 cases are very useful for them, and they are looking for receiving the presentation so they can go deeply in the presentation. You also mentioned to us the importance of how some classical author like Charles Tilly, how the way they reconstructed the daily life, the working class daily life, using the number, the organization, how the number can be used, but also the bias in numbering, which means that it is very important for all historians, all scholars using numbers to be aware about the condition in which statistics are produced and what they should do in order to get to be very critical in the way they use number to illustrate it by and to interpret it in the meaning of this number. So thank you so very much on behalf of all the participants of the conference. We are very grateful to you for the conference, and we wish you a great day. Once again, thank you so much on behalf of all the participants. Thank you.